Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello, and welcome back to the final episode in my series on the Nuremberg war trials of 1945 and 1946, and everything that followed in their terribly long shadow. Over the past few weeks, I've been deep in the work of Philippe Sands, the international law specialist whose books, East, West Street, and The Right Line, explore the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. They're extraordinary books, and they also helped shape much of what follows today. So I spoke about Hermann Goring and his relationship with Kelly in considerable detail, and I kind of walked you through some of the most fascinating and unsettling threads that emerged from that momentous event. For this last episode, I want to step back and look at the legacy of Nuremberg, what it actually meant then, what it changed, and where we find ourselves now because of it. One thing that often goes unmentioned when we talk about Nuremberg is that it didn't happen in isolation. Elsewhere in the world, the machinery of justice was grinding into motion in parallel. Just a few months after Nuremberg began, the Allies decided that there needed to be a similar reckoning for crimes perpetrated by Japan. And so the Tokyo International Military Tribunal set up shop. Effectively, it was designed as a companion to Nuremberg, a kind of mirror trial, applying the same categories of crimes to atrocities committed across the Japanese sphere of influence. It looked and sounded familiar, and it was driven by many of the same ideals, but of course it carried all the same tensions too. It was justice handed down by the victors, uneven, I have to say, and imperfect, even if many still believed it possessed a kind of moral legitimacy. I think what's striking about Tokyo is what didn't happen. The Emperor of Japan was never brought before the court, and that was a decision made at the very highest political levels. Preserving the emperor was seen as essential for Japan to rebuild, to stabilize, to accept defeat. Justice, in this case, bent under the weight of international politics. But the international tribunals were only part of that story. Across Europe and Asia, there were hundreds, in fact, thousands of smaller trials held by national courts. These were long, messy, emotionally charged affairs, and they dragged on for years. And in some places, they continue to this day. I also recently just finished a book on the trial of Marshal Pétain in France, a man who struck a deal with Adolf Hitler in the hope, he said, of sparing France a deeper catastrophe. His trial was one of the most dramatic of the era, but it was only one among many. Collaborators stood trial in country after country. German officers were hunted, caught, and prosecuted. In the Soviet Union, the scale of trials was vast. Across the continent, entire societies were trying to understand what they had lived through and who had done what to whom. So Nuremberg may have been the headline, but the reckoning was actually on a global scale. Across Europe, of course, the reckoning after the Second World War took on a life of its own. There were trials in Poland, trials in Yugoslavia, trials in almost every corner of the continent. It was a vast and sometimes chaotic eruption of legal activity. Entire societies were trying to purge themselves of guilt, anger, betrayal, and complicity. I think what's staggering is that the trials never truly stopped. In Germany today, there are still cases being brought before the courts. The accused, often incredibly elderly, frail men and women who once served as camp guards or accountants or minor officials in the Nazi machine. The law has stretched as far as it can, pursuing individuals for acts committed 80 years ago. But that long pursuit is now coming to an end. It has to. The perpetrators, or the people said to be perpetrators, are reaching the last days of their lives. And as that generation passes, we find ourselves entering a genuinely post-Nazi era for questions of international justice. In the previous episode, I touched on what happened in the 1940s when nations were still arguing over how to interpret Nuremberg and how to turn it into permanent rules of international criminality. But as the world moved into the 1950s, everything shifted. The geopolitical landscape changed almost overnight. Communism became the great terror in the West, and the obsession with Nazism faded. With that shift, momentum drained away from any serious effort to build stronger global justice mechanisms. There were endless discussions and countless drafts within the United Nations, within regional bodies, and with committees like the International Law Commission. There were negotiations to create a permanent international court that could hold individuals anywhere on Earth accountable for the gravest crimes. It was all very earnest and very well intentioned, but in truth, nothing happened. No court was created. No new system emerged. Even as the wars erupted in Suez, in Vietnam, and elsewhere, the legal conversation remained just that, a conversation. The further we moved from 1945, the fewer criminal proceedings remained active across Europe. And in reality, the world just turned away. However, then came the 1990s, and everything changed. The horrors that unfolded in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda shook the international community in a way that had not happened for decades. And it gives me goosebumps just thinking about this. Entire towns in Bosnia were wiped out. In Rwanda, 800,000 people or more were slaughtered in the space of a few weeks. These were not distant historical crimes. These were crimes of our own time, broadcast on television, witnessed by journalists, recorded in real time. With the Cold War finally over and the Soviet Union replaced by the Russian Federation, the United Nations Security Council was able to act with a unity that had been impossible for nearly half a century. It voted to create two new international criminal tribunals, one of the former Yugoslavia and one for Rwanda. And these were the first international tribunals since Nuremberg and Tokyo. And I think for the first time, they were not instruments of victor's justice. They were specifically designed to prosecute crimes committed by any side against any community by whomever was responsible. Their jurisdiction rested on the very crimes first defined at Nuremberg: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The only thing missing was the crime of aggression, which was considered too politically complicated to include. By the mid-1990s, these tribunals were fully operational. They brought warlords, generals, political leaders, and foot soldiers into the courtroom. They revived the spirit of Nuremberg for a new generation, and they set the stage for what would eventually become the International Criminal Court. By the late 1990s, the new tribunals had begun delivering their judgments, and for the first time in history, an international court convicted an individual for the crime of genocide. Another judgment marked the first conviction of a woman for a crime against humanity. Dozens upon dozens of cases followed. It felt really like the dam had burst. After decades of paralysis, international criminal law was suddenly alive again. And running parallel to these ad hoc tribunals, something else was happening. The work that had begun in the 1940s, then stalled for half a century, flickered back into life. At the United Nations International Law Commission, efforts to design a permanent international criminal court resumed. In 1994, the Commission produced a draft statute. That document became the foundation for a vast negotiation that ended in Rome in July 1998 with the adoption of the Statute of the International Criminal Court. For Philip Sands, who was born in 1960 and had no involvement in the Nuremberg or Tokyo era, Rome was a complete turning point. He was there in the room when the ICC took shape. For those present, it felt like the direct, almost inevitable descendant of Nuremberg, a line drawn across 53 years of frustration finally coming to rest in ink. But before we stay in Rome, it's worth returning to Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia for a moment, because there is a cynical argument made that these tribunals only existed because none of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council had their own people in the dock. That it was safe justice, in other words. And there is some truth to the idea that the great powers were protected, but the reality is way more complicated. There was Western involvement in both conflicts. In Rwanda, questions have simmered for years about what France knew, when it knew it, and whether it could have prevented the slaughter. And in the former Yugoslavia, the role of the United States in assisting Croat forces against Serbian units has been heavily scrutinized. These matters were studied indirectly, but they were never allowed to harden into the kind of investigations that put individuals in the courtroom. So this was not victor's justice, but it was still justice delivered in a way, I think, that kept the responsibilities of powerful nations comfortably out of reach. Now, let me take you back to Rome. Philip Sands describes it as a 5-week negotiation, the kind of legal marathon during which people lose all sense of day and night. He served with a group of Pacific Island states as part of the delegation for the Solomon Islands, alongside his very good friend, Andrew Clapham. The Pacific states were asked to draft the preamble to the statute, which is normally regarded as the moral spine of any treaty. The big ideas go there, the deep intentions, the thing future generations quote. So Sands and Clapham decided to write the preamble they believed the world needed, not necessarily the one they assumed would pass. One line they included was this: that every state has a duty to investigate or prosecute any person alleged to have committed an international crime found within its jurisdiction. They expected that sentence to vanish in the editing process, but it didn't. It survived intact. And because it survived, the statute contains a remarkably far-reaching commitment, one that still radiates outwards today. The ICC statute created a permanent tribunal with 18 judges and jurisdiction over 4 core international crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. And it set out the rules, the procedures, the evidentiary standards, and the basic machinery through which the court would function. And it came with one final condition: it would only come into force once 60 countries had ratified it. And that happened in 2002, and a new court was born. Today, around 125 states are parties to the Rome Statute. Many significant nations are inside the system. The United Kingdom and France are both members, but other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council aren't. Russia, China, and the United States have all chosen to remain outside. Israel also hasn't joined, but Palestine has. It is, in other words, a court with global ambition, but not, unfortunately, with universal authority. The way the ICC asserts its jurisdiction is based on 2 fundamental principles. The first is nationality. If you are a national of a state that has joined the ICC, then you are subject to its authority no matter where you are in the world. A British national who commits an act of genocide in the United States can, for example, be prosecuted by the ICC, even though the United States itself is not a party to the statute. The jurisdiction travels with the individual person. The second is territoriality. Any crime covered by this statute, if committed on the territory of a state party, falls within the court's reach. So an American who commits genocide on British soil is, at least in theory, accountable before the ICC. Beyond these 2 pillars, the Security Council can also vote to give the ICC jurisdiction over situations in states that have never joined the statute at all. This mechanism has been used before, and I think it demonstrates how the court sits at the intersection of law and world politics. And of course, there is another crucial idea built into the ICC, and it's one of the most important lessons to emerge from the Nuremberg legacy. It's the principle of complementarity. Complementarity is simple in concept but profound in practice. The ICC is a court of last resort. The primary responsibility for prosecuting international crimes rests with the country where the acts were committed. Only if that country cannot or will not or chooses not to prosecute will the ICC step in. It's not designed to replace a national justice system, but to backstop them, if you like. International trials exist only when domestic trials fail, which of course then brings us to genocide. Genocide, as many listeners will remember, was a term invented by Raphael Lemkin. He introduced it in November 1944 in his book, Axis Rule. For Lemkin, genocide was any act intended to destroy a group in whole or in part. And he set the bar deliberately low. This was never meant to be a numbers game. Lemkin believed that even if a tiny community suffered the targeted killing of only a few members, that could still constitute genocide. So intent is everything. States, however, had different instincts. When they adopted the Genocide Convention in 1948, they tightened the definition. Intent had to be proven more clearly. The destruction of the group had to be deliberate, and the acts had to be aimed at the group as such. Since then, though, the tribunals for Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, and through the early cases of the ICC, the bar has actually risen even higher. Courts now require evidence showing that the only reasonable inference from a pattern of conduct is an intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. If other intentions can plausibly be argued, such as self-defense or counterterrorism, the label of genocide will not apply. And of course, that sparked a new debate about what genocide means in practice today. The question is, has the bar become too high? Has the world become too nervous to call atrocities by their rightful name? Or is the caution necessary, a safeguard against politicizing, one of the most devastating crimes ever conceived? These questions, as I'll try and argue in my closing section, lie at the heart of the modern struggle to carry the Nuremberg legacy into the 21st century. And of course, one of the lingering lessons of Nuremberg concerns the defense of just following orders. If I was standing in front of the ICC today, accused of an international crime, and I tried to defend myself by saying I didn't know what I was doing, or that I was merely obeying commands, how far do you think that would get me? Well, the short answer, as Nuremberg proved, not very far at all. Knowledge and intent are always crucial questions in international law. Courts must prove both. If someone is genuinely unaware of what is happening around them, if they can't reasonably understand that their actions are contributing to a crime, then establishing criminal responsibility becomes very difficult. But that is rarely the case. Most people know, or at least they ought to know, when something is fundamentally wrong. Turning a blind eye is not a defense. Closing your eyes does not make your hands clean. And simply saying, I was following orders, has never held up. If a commandant orders you to execute a field of civilians, you are expected to know that such an order crosses the line into criminality. Nuremberg made that crystal clear. International law does not permit obedience to be a shield. There is also the reverse of that principle, right? Command responsibility. If you are in charge and your subordinate commits crimes, you can be held responsible even if you didn't personally order those acts. This is really important. If you should have known what was occurring, if you failed to prevent or punish wrongdoing, that alone can be enough to trigger criminal liability. Responsibility flows downwards and upwards, something current administrations would be good to remember. So with that in mind, how far has all of this, the ICC and the legacy of Nuremberg, changed the conduct of war? We are living in a moment in which many of the rules governing war are being openly ignored by powerful states. We see it in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see it in Israel's actions in Gaza. And we saw it in the atrocities committed by Hamas on the territory of Israel on the 7th of October 2023. All of these acts in different ways cross into criminality. The real question now is not whether crimes have been committed, but rather what labels courts will eventually apply to them. The ICC has already acted. It has indicted President Putin of Russia for war crimes relating to the deportation of Ukrainian children. It has indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity, along with Hamas operatives for acts committed in both Israel and Gaza. But those indictments raise very difficult legal questions. Russia is not party to the ICC statute. Ukraine, however, has granted the ICC jurisdiction over crimes committed on its territory. So if a Russian national commits a crime inside Ukraine, that person is subject to the ICC. The deeper issue is whether a serving head of state of a non-member country enjoys immunity from prosecution. No individual, not even a sitting head of state, can claim immunity for crimes within the court's mandate. Russia argues the opposite, that because it never consented to the statute, its leader can't lose his immunity. And of course, the judges of the ICC have ruled that immunity does not apply even to non-member heads of state. That ruling is controversial, and it remains the subject of global debate today. And of course, a similar situation has to arise with Israel. An Israeli soldier or operative who commits a crime on the territory of Gaza is subject to ICC jurisdiction because Palestine, which claims Gaza, is party to the statute. But what about the head of government? What about Netanyahu? That is the frontier the ICC now stands upon. The legal questions are immense. The political pressures are extraordinary. And I think the legacy of Nuremberg hangs over all of it. Benjamin Netanyahu has argued that under general international law, he enjoys immunity as a serving head of government. Israel maintains that this immunity has not been removed and cannot be removed by a treaty it never signed. And that is, in fairness, a considerable argument. You know, it's not frivolous. It sits alongside a long-running debate about how far treaties can bind non-members and whether the ICC can pierce through immunities that the broader system of international law still recognizes. So here we are, 80 years after Nuremberg, facing complexities that were barely imaginable in 1945. But one issue, of course, has endured, and it's a deeply uncomfortable one. It goes right back to the earliest criticisms of Nuremberg, the problem of lopsided justice. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. For many years, every individual indicted by the ICC was African or black. Every single one. And Africa, as Philippe Sands points out, doesn't hold a monopoly on international criminality. You know, the message this sent, especially across the global south, was coercive. The imbalance felt baked in, as though the world had returned to Nuremberg's original flaw, where victors judge the vanquished, where their own conduct remains untouched. Afghanistan joined the ICC in 2002, yet no indictments were ever issued for American crimes alleged to have been committed on Afghan soil. none for acts alleged to have taken place in Bagram, none for the actions of the United Kingdom either, although it too was party to the statute. Similarly, there were no indictments relating to the alleged crimes committed in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. And for many observers, these omissions confirmed what they had long suspected, that the ICC pursued crimes where it was politically easy and it avoided those where it wasn't. And this has reinforced the sense that the system, despite its noble intentions, still struggles to deliver justice evenly. The French writer Balzac once wrote that, like a spider's web in which the small flies are caught while the large flies push straight through. It's a brutal line, but many feel it still captures the reality of international criminal justice today. The smaller flies, the weak, the stateless, the non-aligned, find themselves tangled in the strands. The larger ones, well, they escape. And I think perhaps this is why the current ICC prosecutor has taken such interest in seeking warrants for President Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu. If the court never addresses the conduct of the powerful, it will never escape the accusation that it is perpetuating lopsided justice. That critique has haunted Nuremberg since the day the Nuremberg doors opened. So that begs the question, what's next? Imagine, and admittedly an unlikely scenario, that President Putin were to travel to Britain and was taken into custody. Would he end up in the ICC? Would he be flown to The Hague? Would international law finally reach a point where even the largest fly can't pass through the web? In strict legal terms, if President Putin were to set foot in Britain, the United Kingdom, as a member of the ICC statute, would be under an obligation to arrest him and to transfer him to The Hague. And that's law on paper. But as always, the law on paper rarely meets the law in practice. Britain also has domestic rules that give a serving head of state absolute immunity unless that immunity has been removed by that country's own participation in an international treaty. Russia never joined the Rome Statute, so would a British court say Putin's immunity is intact? Would it say the ICC statute overrides that immunity? Would it say the two legal orders collide? You know, these are questions that I can't answer. I'm no judge, but there are certainly questions for future judges, for future courts, and I think for a world wrestling with the outer limits of international justice. We are firmly in territory that is genuinely uncertain. There is one final area of law that may shape the next generation of international criminality: ecocide. If you look at the full sweep from Nuremberg to Yugoslavia to Rwanda to the ICC and the specialized tribunals in Cambodia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and Syria, all of them focus on what we might call anthropocentric crimes. Harm done to people, violence inflicted on the human body or the human community, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, aggression, they all turn on the protection of the human. But what about crimes against the natural world? What about deliberate destruction of ecosystems, mass poisoning of land, water, or air? What about the collapse of biodiversity or reckless damage to the climate system? These barely fit within any existing categories. And so the idea of ecocide emerges. It first appeared during the Vietnam War among American sociologists who were horrified by the use of Agent Orange, and it gathered support over the decades. Most recently, the English barrister Polly Higgins devoted herself to building a movement to recognize ecocide as a fifth international crime. A few years ago, she chaired a working group to propose an actual legal definition, and last December, a group of states formally proposed an amendment to the ICC statute to include ecocide. Look, that will be a very long road, but I think what's remarkable is how deeply it resonates with the current young generation. You know, students in Paris, students in London, young people everywhere are asking about the environment with a passion that is unmistakable. Many of them aren't energized by genocide or war crimes, but they are energized by ecocide. They see it as a crime of daily life, a question of how we treat the planet at all times, not just during conflict. And I have no doubt that in time, perhaps sooner than we think, ecocide will become part of international criminal law. Which, of course, brings me to the final question in this episode. Why should we care about Nuremberg at all? Look, folks, Nuremberg was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in human history, nations stood together and declared that the power of the state is not absolute. Kings, presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of war, generals, they no longer had the right to treat their citizens or the citizens of any other country as they pleased. The state could no longer hide behind sovereignty. Law stepped in and said, there is a line that you cannot cross, and if you cross it, you're going to be held accountable. And of course, that idea changed everything. It influenced every tribunal that followed. It shaped the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the ad hoc tribunals of the 1990s, the International Criminal Court, and now even the emerging conversations about ecocide. Nuremberg was very imperfect. It was lopsided. It definitely had blind spots, but it cracked open a door that had been shut for centuries, and it lit a path towards a world in which power, even the greatest power, could be restrained by law, and rightfully so. As we look at the world today, from Ukraine to Gaza to the Amazon to the melting ice shelves and poisoned rivers, it remains the only path we have. The legacy of Nuremberg definitely isn't a finished project. It's a question thrown forward in time. It asks us, what kind of world do we want to live in, and what are we willing to do to protect it? And that's why we care. That's why this matters. And that is why, even now, nearly 80 years on, the echoes of Nuremberg still shape the world around us. You cannot kill and disappear individuals. You cannot kill and disappear entire groups. And you cannot hide behind your own domestic law to justify it. After Nuremberg, those days ended. For the first time in history, international law placed limits on the sovereign. It's really astonishing how recent, all this shift is. If you think in the 1930s, as Lemkin said, if a state chose to eliminate half its population, no rule of international law forbade it. Sovereignty was a wall effectively behind which everything could happen. Nuremberg shattered that wall. It declared that states can't commit crimes, that leaders must be held responsible, that humanity has boundaries no flag can excuse. Those principles moved outward into the Genocide Convention, the Convention Against Torture, the coming Convention on Crimes Against Humanity, the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and finally, the International Criminal Court. And they have also moved into national courts through the idea of universal jurisdiction. Pinochet actually proved it. Pinochet arrived in London in 1998, expecting a quiet medical stay. 16 days later, he was under arrest on a warrant from a Spanish judge. Genocide, torture, disappearance. And in a decision that now stands alongside Nuremberg, the House of Lords ruled that a former head of state accused of torture cannot claim immunity. If the treaty applies, sovereignty doesn't. That was the Nuremberg principle, reaching across half a century to drag a dictator into the light. Yet here we are, 80 years later, in a world still full of violence and impunity. War crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, genocide, they unfold. When I was researching this, I was thinking they unfold every year, but they actually unfold every few months. And of course, now new questions are emerging. Take the concern of the United States operations in Venezuelan waters, where suspected drug boats have been blown apart on intelligence that some critics say is very far from certain. The question is, do these actions fall within the laws of armed conflict? Do they risk crossing into unlawful killings? And if intent and evidence are ever scrutinized by future courts, could individuals one day find themselves facing the very principles born at Nuremberg? Look, they're not easy questions, folks, but they show why Nuremberg still matters. And this is where I think I want to end, with the reminder that international law is a long game. When Philippe Sands was a young lecturer at Cambridge, he often talked about these issues with Sir John Baker, the great historian of English law. And Sir John would listen and then say, we had a similar problem in English law, and it took 275 years to sort it out. And of course, this is where we are now, at the start of a very long journey. International law won't deliver miracles overnight. It will frustrate us, it will disappoint us, and sometimes it will make us all look powerless. But don't abandon it. We hold to the principles that matter, that the power of the sovereign is never absolute, that no government can kill, torture, or disappear its own people with impunity. That's the law, imperfect as it is, and it remains our best defense against the darkest part of ourselves and our leaders. That's the message of Nuremberg, and that's why it still matters. So before I close, one last question that Philippe Sands often hears. If he had been a German lawyer in 1944, would he have defended any one of the Nuremberg accused? His answer, I thought, was really thoughtful. He believes everyone, no matter who they are, is entitled to a lawyer who will defend their rights. He's represented states and individuals whose values he doesn't share. And that, he says, is part of the social function of the lawyer. So his answer to my question would, of course, be yes. But I think he might pause if I asked him about Hans Frank. Hans Frank, ladies and gentlemen, was one of Adolf Hitler's earliest loyalists, a lawyer who fashioned himself as the movement's legal mind. But history remembers him for something far darker. He was appointed Governor General of occupied Poland in 1939, and he ruled the territory as a personal fiefdom in complete terror. Under his administration, millions of Jews and Poles were persecuted, dispossessed, enslaved, or murdered. Frank oversaw forced labor, mass shootings, and also the confinement of Jewish populations into ghettos. And his general government became a staging ground for the Holocaust's deadliest machinery. He liked to call himself the King of Poland, living in a castle in Krakow while issuing decrees that crushed, literally, an entire population. So he's a man effectively charged with the murder of 4 million people. So I think Sands might pause when asked to represent that particular man. But you know what? I still think that he would say yes, that every man deserves justice. And that, folks, brings us to the end of this two-part episode. The first was on Hermann Goring, and finishing now just talking about where Nuremberg led us and the legacy that it left behind. A dark story, absolutely, but an essential one. I think it shows how we arrived at the world that we currently live in, and how far, much more importantly, we still have to travel. Philippe Sands' books are extraordinary. I would have to say my favorite is probably The Last Colony, but equally good is East-West Street, The Rat Line, and 38 Laundress Street. They're available in all good bookshops and well worth your time. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.